Howdy gamers, we got her ladies and gentlemen, so without delay, we're just going to move right into the discussion about Hu Tao here. She is a sub-burst DPS that's mildly tanky. However, as things develop, we're seeing her on the field more and more. So getting right into her abilities and talents, her charge attack is a very dominant theme to the character. It has a short charge forward, and when it's affected by your elemental skill, it does pyro damage, which means you're kind of screwed against pyro enemies, but activating your elemental skill is a massive boost to her attack and overall damage at the cost of HP. So she's kind of like Zhao in a sense, where you always want him inside his elemental burst. You're going to want to use that skill as soon as it's up, and when it expires, you just don't want her on the field at all. The interrupt resistance on it is great for knockback heavy fights, like Zhongli's elemental skill. Concerning the Blood Blossom dot, it ticks roughly twice over its full duration unless you refresh it. It's only applied with charged attacks, and it goes up to like 4 potential ticks. So overall, the full damage on the dot is nothing crazy, but it's basically an extra charge attack over its full duration, not really taking those pyro damage modifiers into account. So what you're going to want to do as Hu Tao is be in her elemental skill and just spam your charge attack. So moving on to the rest of her kit, the elemental burst deals heavy damage and compensates for the health loss that you've accrued by using her elemental skill. And that amount of damage is her elemental burst. Very impactful. You're just going to want to use it every time you get it, but it is worth mentioning that you're going to want to make sure you use it inside the elemental skill. Hu Tao's whole gimmick here is you basically don't want to play the character while the elemental skill is on cooldown and the buff is off. So her character talents, the crit rate after the elemental skill fades, is even more of an indication that she makes for an awesome sub DPS. And her second character talent that gives extra pyro damage under 50% HP means it's a valid option to constantly game her HP to have it under 50% to do an exceptional amount more damage. Continuing on into the weapons, artifact stats and all that, taking a look at her stats, as she ascends, she scales with crit damage. Is a good simple damage boost, and as a result of this, you're going to want to spend a lot of your item budget on your artifacts and such into crit rate. Or weapons with crit rate on it. Like, this budget compensation is basically countered by deathmatch. The 2-to-1 crit damage to crit rate ratio for general application is a meme, but all the same, you want to keep them balanced, and that's just a good general reference to begin with. So artifact stats, on your main stats, you're going to want to go for the Pyro Goblet, obviously, crit rate or crit damage on your hat, depending on your stats. Like for example, crit damage if you have the crit rate from Deathmatch, as I just mentioned earlier. And in general, on your sands, you're going to want HP percent, unless you're using a reaction-based comp and your elemental mastery is low. I believe the community math that's based on if you have sub 300 elemental mastery on your sands is going to be more beneficial for your damage. So just looking at stats in a vacuum, the priority of them would be your crit damage to crit rate ratio, followed by HP percent, with that special note there on elemental mastery being a priority if your elemental mastery is low. All of that followed by attack percentage, and finished off by the flat attack and HP stats. It's worth reminding that this isn't a comprehensive telling every single Hu Tao needs to follow this directive. You need to gauge how much or how little of each stat you have, and then follow that up with the value of what remains out there that you don't have. So artifact sets here, she's a pyro character. We're putting her in a lot of reaction comps. That seems to work out best, so Crimson Witch is just the best in general, as long as you have those consistent reactions. If you don't, or your Elemental Witch set is really bad, you're using her Elemental Burst on cooldown, So Noblesse is a good option. 2-piece that with the Witch 2-piece. Again, if you're not using Crimson Witch for whatever reason, there is Retracing Bolide. If you have a shield dominant comp, that will really boost up your charged attacks, but you're going to want to make sure that you aren't losing your shields. Lastly, if everything just sucks and you have okay Gladiator or Wanderer's pieces, just throw that 2-piece in there with Crimson Witch and that'll work. If you have no reactions whatsoever, then Lava Walkers is a fine last resort as well. Weapons, anything really works. There's only 2 that are super worth mentioning, going out of your way for. Starting with the 5 stars, all 5 stars really work, but of course there's Staff of Homa, and I mean if you know what Staff of Homa is and you're willing to roll on a weapon banner, you don't really need this information, but Staff of Homa is the end-all be-all 5-star weapon for Hu Tao specifically. If by some means you can get that, or just get super lucky, you're set for life with Hu Tao. But if you have any 5 stars, you're good. Moving down to 4 stars, Deathmatch is very easy to get. It's great for damage, great for defense, it's good all-purpose. And there's not really much worth mentioning beyond Deathmatch. Just if you have Hu Tao and you want a weapon for her specifically, just get Deathmatch. Everything else is too gimmicky and a bit too much of a meme, like the Dragon's Bane one. There is the Lithic Spear that may be worth mentioning. That gets a lot of value from refines, but your team comp can really suffer for it, just trying to fit all of those 4 slots into being Liyue characters. TLDR, just get Deathmatch. Continuing into Constellations, her C1 just turns her into the charge attack spammer. It basically takes the brakes off of being able to spam charged attack with no stamina consumption. On paper, initially in try mode, this seemed useless, but it is actually absolutely amazing in practice. You're spamming your charge attacks, Hu Tao stays real low on health as it is, you're out of stamina, and then a big whammer comes along, and you have no stamina left to dash out of it. That's just not a concern. If you have C1, it ups your survivability, and it increases your damage by ensuring all of your charge attacks actually hit, because you can use that excess stamina to dash back in range to continue making sure all your charge attacks lands, which we'll talk about later in the gameplay notes. C2, there's some large potential gains here, naturally as it reads for your dot. The more HP you accumulate, just the further your dot damage goes. C3, relatively minor dot and attack damage increase, same deal with all C3s. C4 just further solidifies her sub role when that E goes off to switch in DPS for a heavy crit based alternative DPS in her comp. C5 is just a chunky portion of damage onto the elemental burst. Always like that. And lastly, C6 just makes her the immortal tank. Unless you're getting roasted and blasted beyond belief every 60 seconds, you just won't die. And if you game your health around that 25% margin, you don't need to invest as heavily into crit. It just makes her essentially immortal as long as you can survive for 60 seconds, and just amps her damage through the roof. So, I mean, naturally, like with most DPS characters, if you can get to C6 and that's an option for you, go for it. In terms of her team comps and synergies, she didn't really look like a potential main DPS before release, but that's kind of easily been proven wrong. You're just going to need solid filler for when her elemental skill is on CD, whether that's damage or you're just filling it entirely with full support for her. In terms of her support, ZQ is her primetime team comp buddy. You're hardly going to want Hu Tao in a comp without ZQ in trying to get the most damage out of her. That's also a good thing she's Pyro. You can pair her with Bennett for some sick resonance. There's just minor HP gimmicks with his elemental burst. So moving into some comp suggestions, just overall, she's definitely reaction based. starting off, you may want to put her in a melt comp. Keeping ZQ with her, you'll always have Vaporize. For example, the comp I'm going to use, even though it's not the most optimal, is a Cryo comp with Ganyu. The crit rate passive with Cryo Resonance and her passive talent. There's just an excellent amount of crit compensation. The only bad thing is that her low dot damage is going to be sniping some melt sometimes when you want it on the ult and charge attacks. Another 5-star comp that's applicable to any damage character is a shield comp with like Albedo and Zhongli. Just fits with any DPS. Just put her with those two guys for Geo Resonance and just throw in a Vaporize ZQ or Melt reaction in there and you're good to go. If you're free to play or just want to throw some 4 stars in your Hu Tao comp, obviously your best bet, no matter what comp, is going to be ZQ. You can put Kea in there, Diona for Cryo Resonance. Basically, all that's worth mentioning here is ZQ with Hu Tao. Beyond that, Kea, Bennett, Diona, even Fischl, they're all mixers and matchers based on whether you need what you need more of, more support, healing, damage, as long as you keep ZQ in there. But again, these are samples and you're just going to have to wait to see how the meta evolves and gauge what you need in terms of how you're playing your Hu Tao. One special note about Bennett that was mentioned earlier, being that 70% HP buffer every time he uses his elemental burst, it's going to put her above that threshold to activate her extra pyro damage passive talent. So if you're gaming her HP and you want to use Bennett, that's just something you need to constantly keep your eye on. Gameplay notes here. Her dash moves through things, her sprint dash, giving her a little bit more mobility, making that more well-rounded and not impeded by things like shields and whatnot. However, this isn't the case for very large enemies, so don't go thinking that you can just teleport through them. More additions, Constellation 1 and Homa really make her pop off. Like, she's a solid, well-rounded character all on her own, but she's a completely different character, as is the standard with these constellations and weapons that keep coming out that just really advance her damage to completely new heights. There's a lot to manage if she isn't super overcompensated with support. You have to manage her stamina, especially if you don't have C1. That's very taxing. You have to manage her HP, keep an eye on that. Her energy, the energy of her and her supports, and just movement in general. Like Xiao, auto-targeting is a big part of her kit here, and the auto-targeting with her charge attack can be a pretty big nuisance if it puts you where you don't want to go or towards an enemy that you aren't trying to focus on. She doesn't seem to feel like a super unique role besides just coming out, popping her skill, and just blowing things up. Tankiness was like her only unique offering, and that's mainly offset by her HP being just a currency. But with C6, all of that just gets dialed up to 11 again. And more points on C6. There's not like a crazy impactful use for it in the current game, but when it procs, it'll be a lifesaver and will just amp your damage to unseen levels. It's basically just a get out of jail free card, and I'm 100% positive there'll be a time anywhere from Inazuma or beyond that her death recovery gimmick will have some insane niche application that will just wow the entire community, and I want her at C6 for that application alone, but it's just not happening, and a one-off specific situation is certainly not recommended at all to try and C6 for. But obviously, if you're going for C6 through Tao and that's within your repertoire, this information is probably already entirely useless for you. Long story short here, gameplay-wise for Hu Tao, she can pump out massive damage, but there's just so many trade-offs and so many barriers to entry to get to those super high heights of damage. that she's barely better than any other standard mainline pyro DPS that's in the game right now. Just some notes on the story here as I immerse myself in that and take the opportunity in a video like this to just hit the keynotes of it. Her story deals with the horrors of mortality, and yet Hu Tao keeps a cheerful and forward demeanor. And even though that's seemingly blind optimism, it's apparent that she knows more than she lets on, as she's, very formidable, knowledgeable, and capable in her field. There's just a lot going on with her story, a lot of interesting nuance, and any more than that, you'll have to dive into yourself. But I always like to take a moment to highlight what's going on with their story and her and the Wangxing funeral parlor. So lastly, with our closing notes here, should you be an early adopter of Hu Tao? Again, if you like the character, as I do, certainly go for it. However, there's definitely options if you don't have her. Zhang Lang is a good enough pyro sub that stands to stand in on her own. So I wouldn't really suggest going for Hu Tao solely for gameplay, unless you have the reserves to, get C1, get Homa, get all of those things that just make her a unique blaster on her own. So much of her character-related material, personally resonates with me, and that's how I justify rolling on Hu Tao. So TLDR, if you like the character, roll it up. If you don't, you aren't missing anything revolutionary unless you blow the big bucks on her. So I believe that's all for this video. I think we can conclude it there. If I missed anything or glossed over anything, just leave a comment or suggestion down in the comment section, and may the Gotcha God bless your wishes. See you next time.